Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third and final panel of this conference, which is the only one that has a title which is potentially somewhat uplifting, namely, "Can it happen here?" And what can we do about it? So I'm Ian Shapiro, and I'm happy to be moderating this panel. We do have 7 speakers who we will call each to speak for up to 10 minutes as the names appear on the program in that order. So we will start with Julia Azari from Marquette University, then Emily Bazelon from the New York Times and the Yale Law School, David Frum from The Atlantic, Tom Ginsburg from the University of Chicago, and also Aziz, I believe the pronunciation is, also from the University of Chicago, Francis Lee from the University of Maryland, and Yascha Mounk from Harvard. So welcome all, and without further ado, Julia.
All right, give me 1 second to pull up my notes and make the Wi-Fi happy. Otherwise, it'll interrupt me every couple of seconds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Trump in a broader historical context. And I want to start this out by saying that typically when I address an audience to talk about Trump, and I'm here with fellow academics and people who write for elite journalistic outlets in a mostly white context, in a mostly liberal context, and we've spent the last half a day talking about the problems posed by Trump supporters and the Trump administration, assuming that these are folks that are politically distant from ourselves and from the political tradition that we align with. What I want to start by saying is that we ought to be attuned to the fact that the calls are coming from inside the House, that there's more in the American political tradition that is normal here than we typically expect. And so having started that way, I also want to challenge the premise of the wonderful people who brought me here, and the idea that there's a bright line of democracy that periodically gets crossed. Rather, in the United States context, which is what I'm going to talk about, I want to mention that the compromises necessary for stability and legitimacy of our democratic institutions often coexist with profoundly substantively undemocratic ideas, undemocratic practices, and particularly in the United States context, undemocratic practices around race. My main claim here is that while Trump is unique in many, many ways, he also represents the latest iteration in a pattern that I see as infrequent but long-standing. Every time we have a president in the United States who disrupts the racial order, they have a particular kind of successor. And here, as I define what this successor is like, I have a bunch of hypotheses, many questions, and few answers. So we've heard Trump compared with Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, impeached, a racist, and someone who's generally portrayed by historians as temperamentally unsuited to the office. We've also seen Trump compared many times with Richard Nixon, with Nixon's approach to rule of law, to abuse of power, and again, that tends to go back to character issues. And I want to put this into a little bit more of a structural context and talk less about character. So first off, backlash is an established feature of U.S. democracy. We've talked about this a little bit in the morning sessions. Toward the end, we really started to touch on some of the racial questions. So this is a very familiar dynamic that I expect that many of you have considered before. When we have some form of racial progress in the United States, there's often a movement of people that want to push back against it, and often that people in that movement have some access to power. I think that's right. And I think that that's a big part of this Johnson-Nixon-Trump pattern. But I think there's another part of it that's much more challenging to pin down, and that's legitimacy. That not only do we get backlash politics, but each time there's something about the presidency that is undermined fundamentally when the racial order is disrupted. That it's not only that we have a backlash figure with some character problems, but that everything in the equilibrium of the system is thrown off. We can't reach majorities, as I mentioned in my memo. For those of you who might have had a chance to read it, I mentioned that Johnson, Nixon, and now Trump all are non-majority presidents. Johnson, of course, an accidental president after Lincoln's assassination. Nixon wins a narrow plurality in 1968 as a law and order candidate. And of course, Trump, who fell well shy of the popular vote, representing the biggest distortion between the Electoral College and the popular vote that we've seen. That, I think, is a feature of not just what happens to presidential candidates in a backlash context, but what happens to American politics when the racial order is disrupted. And I think that's something that's much more difficult both intellectually to figure out why and what the indicators of that are, and also to face up to morally and as residents and citizens of the United States. But I think that this helps us reimagine what this institution is, or excuse me, what this administration is and why this has happened. So I want to take a second and think about the politics of compromise that led up to each of these disruptions. The presidency is implicated in racial compromises that hold the nation together and make the nation stable. And this leads up, I think many of us are familiar with this in the context of the Civil War. Leading up to the Civil War, US politics is a series of unsatisfying compromises that increasingly lead to instability and that really don't address the needs of both sides, of either side. This came up a few times this morning as we talked about politics that cannot solve the problems of the United States, but I also think this is important to think about as we hold up compromise as a critical democratic value. Compromise isn't always compatible with substantive democracy. Leading up to the Civil War, we see that, and then with Lincoln, a refusal to engage in those kinds of compromises. Ultimately, at the end of the Civil War, around slavery, ultimately the Civil War becomes about slavery, and the racial order is upended. And it's in that context that Andrew Johnson becomes president and tries to use the power of the state to bring back as much of that pre-Civil War racial order as possible, to limit the extent to which the fundamental institutions of the American state are changed. I think this is also true to a degree in the 1960s. So after the Civil War, we get a period of new compromises around race, and we get a new period of racial institutions. In the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson changes that. And once again, we have a successor who ends up facing impeachment, who runs on a backlash platform, and who's a non-majority president. The mechanics of how this failure of legitimacy work in each of these cases, I think, is something I've hypothesized about more than I've had a chance to really test. So I'm open to any suggestions about what might be going on there. But it seems to me that in each of these historical instances, we do see elements of our current moment where it's not clear where to go forward. Everything has been disrupted and uprooted. And so you have a backlash movement that doesn't exactly control the country. You have a new status quo, the implementation of which and the future of which is unclear. After the 1960s, we get a new racial status quo in which was described this morning as a fuller American democracy, and I think that's true. The protection of civil and voting rights does fundamentally change American politics. But what I think we all learned in the last 8 years is that it's not a post-racial order like maybe some people expected. Instead, we've got a colorblind order in which, once again, that power of the presidency is a power of maintaining a certain kind of racial power. And Obama's presence in that office challenged the connection between whiteness and presidential power. And I think that's ultimately what leads us to our Trump moment. There's lots of evidence that this mattered, and we talked a whole lot this morning about the economy. The economy obviously always drives a good deal of voting behavior. That's an important part of the story. But there's mounting evidence that race is what's driving a lot of political attitudes today. Racial divisions along both attitudinal lines and demographic lines have defined American politics really since since 1980 in our current iteration. But in 2016, political scientist Michael Tesler found that racial attitudes were actually more important in determining whether someone voted for Trump or Clinton than they were in determining in 2008 whether someone chose Obama or McCain. We have lots of examples of how that mattered in electing Trump. So I've just gotten my 2-minute warning, so I want to move on, having been extremely depressing about American political history, to talk a little bit about moving forward. And here I want to kind of shift over to thinking about the legitimacy that underlies this incredible presidential power that's been so deeply and inextricably linked with untenable racial compromise and with whiteness in the United States. What are our possibilities moving forward? I think that history suggests that the most likely possibility moving forward is that we'll move into a new untenable compromise, and that we'll have another 40-year period of stability that will then be interrupted, and the cycle will repeat. We usually suggest, when we talk about political cycles in the United States, we usually think of them in terms of stagnation. That in a 40-year period, by the end, one party's ideology has become stagnant, their coalition has become stagnant or doesn't make sense anymore, and that's when we get instability. And I'm suggesting instead that instability is really rooted in disruption. And I think that that's something to think about also going forward, is to have an eye on this dynamic between stagnation and disruption. When we disrupt these morally untenable compromises, it really does throw off the rest of the system. I think this leads us to some different questions about rehabilitating the United States system, and I do think that rehabilitating is the right choice of language. That we might want to think about not just how to revert to some kind of status quo of a functional American democracy, but how to break out of this pattern of creating an untenable compromise and instead create an institutional stability worth preserving.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'm going to play the card of being the journalist on the panel with David. He'll also play that card, I now
I'm
realize.
a simple country lawyer.
And talk a little bit about the challenge of journalistic norms in the Trump era, which is something that I think after the election in particular, I know I've been wrestling with. A lot of my colleagues have been talking and thinking about a lot, and I have certainly in hearing from people who consume journalism, in particular readers of the New York Times, I think there's a kind of sense of urgency about this. After the election, a couple of times I was speaking before an audience, perhaps not as erudite as this one, and not talking particularly about the New York Times at all, and found that what people really wanted to express to me was rage at the paper and at the whole profession, a sense that we had failed and that Trump was really our fault. And I think there are completely legitimate critiques to be mounted, both about journalism before the election and about the Times' coverage. But what I think is more important now, in some ways, I don't mean to be ducking, but I'm more interested in what we do since the election, kind of going forward. How do we handle this presidency? And are we at risk of overcorrecting as much as we are at not being presenting the alarming possibilities enough? And I think that is the kind of constant tension for the press, this question of holding on to our role, making sure we stay within what the profession feels is a kind of band of normalcy, but at the same time acknowledging and recognizing and really digging into the ways that this is a different kind of president. And I don't think that we have come up with particularly satisfying answers on that front. As a consumer of journalism, I often feel the most frustrated with television news to this regard. I think there's a way in which the very lucrative cable format of a round table where people are arguing is itself kind of a form of disinformation, and yet something that has completely continued since the election. But I do think there is also a danger in the press getting out in front too far of changing norms. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about two areas, kind of our use of language and then our role as kind of predictors or triangulators, imagining what happens next. So in the language realm, headlines are often our biggest challenge. It's one thing when you can read all the layers and nuance of 1,000 or 1,200 word story, and it's another thing to have to summarize that point of view really quickly at the top. And so after the election, as I was also watching the Times to see how we were changing or remaining the same, I found myself wanting clearer headlines. So for example, the day that Scott Pruitt was chosen as the EPA nominee, the initial headline said climate change skeptic. And there was a lot of, I remember myself thinking, I don't think that goes far enough. What about the word denier, which seems clear and which seemed warranted? I think if I had to defend the editorial choices that were being made, there was a sense, again, of not getting ahead, of not losing our broader audience ideologically to the extent that we have one, by being seen as too extreme and too partisan. I think another example of this is the term alt-right, which the press completely went for. And when we did that because we like to call groups by the words that they choose for themselves. So when the alt-right came up with this descriptor, the press was happy to have that word to use. And also, it's... and this is my problem with it, there's a kind of lightheartedness to it, a sort of catchy slogan, and it felt like a new thing, which we in the press love new things too much. But I felt myself in describing, for example, the website Breitbart, that there was a way in which this term alt-right was not really capturing what was going on that site, wasn't really an accurate rendition of the thinking being expressed, of really what it stood for and its connections. And so I was working on a piece, and I used the term white nationalist to describe Breitbart, and it got taken out, not by my editor, but actually by the legal review that the Times did for this piece. And I went to bat for white nationalist because I felt like that I had shown that I was providing evidence in the story for the kinds of attributes of Breitbart that merited that designation, and that there was a way in which being too careful in describing Breitbart, giving them too much deference and getting to choose how they were described, was itself not fully informing our readers, not really being as clear and candid as we should be in describing that site. I'm pretty sure I won that battle, though now in this moment I can't completely remember. And then the other challenge, I think, for us has been just when something happens and it seems like it's unprecedented, how do we make that clear? So one way we make that clear is we use the word unprecedented all the time, right? Everything is remarkable. This is like another word that I feel like I read all the time, or striking, or unusual. And those words are safe for journalists because they sort of herald you should be paying attention without saying horrible or, crazy or mad, when in fact that is probably often what we mean. And I am not sure anymore whether I think those words are really useful. The more they are used, the more they themselves become part of the new normal. And I think the less people maybe pay attention to them. I'm not really sure what to do about that dilemma, though, because when we call things, crazy or terrible, we are, at least in the news page of the New York Times and most mainstream outlets, kind of stepping outside of our role. And then again, we have this problem of overcorrecting. So the last thing I wanted to mention was this issue of prediction. So I was wrestling with this right after the election. As Jeff Sessions was being proposed as the nominee for Attorney General, I decided I wanted to write about the Justice Department. To me, it seemed remarkable, striking, unprecedented, unusual to have Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General, someone who had been deemed too kind of tarred by racist remarks to be confirmed as a judge back in the mid-1980s. But the way I wanted to kind of figure out what it really meant to have Jeff Sessions as Attorney General was to think about how the Justice Department has handled civil rights, in particular for different Republican presidencies. Like, what happens to the Civil Rights Division as it goes back and forth between Democratic and Republican presidencies. And so I did a lot of reporting. I knew something about the 80s Justice Department. I really didn't know very much at all about George H.W. And connecting Reagan to the first Bush to the second Bush demonstrated some really interesting shifts and tensions that I think align with some of what Julia was talking about in terms of seeing our history of changing values and changing ways of approaching race in different presidencies as having a great deal of impact and a great deal of shifting before Trump ever showed up. And once I had that reporting under my belt, I felt much more comfortable in thinking, okay, so now I know what conservative principles in the Civil Rights Division have been tried before. For example, in the area of voting, we'd have seen previous moments, particularly under George W. Bush, where voter fraud becomes suddenly a priority for the Justice Department in a way that is probably, what I would say, is really not necessary in terms of how frequently it happens, which is to say very rarely. But it came up as a big issue. It actually caused a lot of scandal in the early 2000s. And so knowing about that history made me more confident about trying to figure out, okay, if Sessions takes over, what are we likely to see? And the sort of satisfying part of that kind of journalism is that it's trying to use the historical context and kind of the tools, the other tools that I use as a journalist of talking to the people who are likely to be the decision makers or kind of watching to see how things are going to change. And then also, using all of that history, but then trying to make some prediction, trying to move forward in a way that feels to me like it's still grounded in the reporting. I get very nervous when I'm predicting something based on just my own kind of sense of what is going to happen, because really, who cares about that? To close, I think the question that we're all still wrestling with, and we just won't be able to tell until more time has passed, is whether the press is doing a good enough job of identifying what is new and different and what the threats are to the American democracy without kind of overreacting in a way that itself causes its own identity and its own role in the democracy to be changed. In a sense, if the press becomes less creditable because we are attacking Trump too much, we are assuming things about him that turn out not to be true, then that will be more damage that he's kind of done through us. And that seems like a good thing to avoid. Thank you.
So, thank you. So there goes my opening gag.
Sorry, David.
Speaking of gags, one of the biggest impediments to understanding and appreciating the drama of some of the events that are going on in Washington is their frequently farcical nature. That how can it be that things are alarming when they are also so frequently funny? So just to put this in context, in the past 48 hours, we have seen the Secretary of State, at the urgent demand and insistence of the President of the United States, hold a press conference to not deny that he called the President a moron. And then the President, understandably dissatisfied with this response, the next morning, in a rage, tweeted a demand that the Senate Intelligence Committee hold hearings on whether the Secretary of State had called the President a moron. That's pretty funny. Maybe the laughs get you through. I want to start my talk with an historical analogy. And I'm mindful, one of the professors I had when I was a student here many years ago, Roberto Lopez, had a saying that I heard once, I've repeated probably 10,000 times, and its wisdom never escapes me. And that was the warning: history never repeats itself, said Professor Lopez. It only appears to do so to those who do not pay attention to details. Our situation is always new. But I want to invoke this analogy not as an example of history repeating itself, but as a way of thinking about something. And a way of thinking about something that may be a little uncomfortable for some of the people in this room. As Professor Snyder said, it is often difficult to see things when you are in them. So I'm about to talk about something that many of the people in this room are in. In the years after World War II, the United States and its democratic friends face an extremist challenge in the force of a global communist movement, both abroad and at home. And this movement worked both by external subversion and by internal revolutionary activity. It was weaker in the United States than in many other places, but people didn't really know that. It was hard to have a good sense of the scope of how intense this danger was. And in many places of the world, this danger was obviously very extreme. It took over by force, where the Soviet armies had been, and it worked by subversion in places like Czechoslovakia, and nearly so in France and Italy. The governments of the Western world, the democratic world, met this challenge with two basic tactics. The first was a policy of confrontation, often armed confrontation, that communist armies were met by containment, deterrence, and sometimes outright conflict. Communist movements inside the countries were subjected to a great deal of repression. But they joined this policy of confrontation to a policy of concession. That where communist parties were battening on authentic grievances, these grievances were met with concessions, of which the two most important were decolonization. Communist parties were often strong in colonized areas. Especially at the pressure of the United States, colonized areas were decolonized, and through the building of social insurance states after World War II. The fear of unemployment and old age and poverty and sickness. These were real feelings that people had. And if the only people who would offer a solution to that problem were the communists, then people would turn to the communists. We face, in the Western world, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, a new extremist movement. And we can call it the alt-right, we can call it nationalist populism, we can call it neo-fascism, we can call it whatever we want. The grievance it feeds on is the cultural and economic shock of mass migration from the poor world to the Western world. I think the consensus of many people on the liberal side is the way to deal with this extremist movement is with a policy of confrontation only. They are wrong, they must be scolded, and they must be told that they are completely mistaken and no concessions at all. And so in describing the ways in which the Trump administration is dangerous, its attitude toward immigration has been taken not as a source of its strength, but as its most odious marker and the thing to be most militantly confronted. And I would like to suggest that you think about this in a different way, and that we find in dealing with the grievances that animate the rising tide of extremism across the Western world some of the wisdom of the generation of 1945 to 1960, and understand there are some concessions that have to be made here if you want to move away the sources of power and dynamism and strength from the extremist movements that threaten your democratic institutions. I notice when this is a hard thought to process. Daniel Zilblatt, whose book I so lavishly reviewed and whose wisdom I really cherish and admire, in his list of norm violations in the run-up to Donald Trump, I'm a Republican, so I noticed it was a kind of Democratic-heavy list. All the norm violations were committed by Republicans. And I will admit the situation is asymmetric, that what the Republicans have done in the period from 2000 to 2016 was more and worse than what the Democrats did, and in particular the threat to put the United States into default unless they won their every single demand they had in the budget negotiation. That was an unprecedented thing and really dangerous, a mark of how this country is tumbling down the stairs toward ever more extreme behaviors, ever more willingness to contemplate out of the ordinary measures in order to get your way. But here's runner-up to that, the second most important norm violation of the period, or the second most important executive branch, second most important norm violation, the most important executive branch norm violation, was President Obama's immigration orders. You'll remember that in Obama's first term, he was repeatedly pressed, can you do some kind of executive action on the illegal alien population? I took a tally, I've written a book about this. I have found, and I'm not a great researcher, 6 specific instances where President Obama described this action as illegal, as a violation of presidential authority, as something that was absolutely not to be thought of. I'm not a king, he would say. I do not have this power. But as the 2012 election got closer and closer, and as he became more nervous, because you'll remember 2012, the economy looked really strong in the early part of 2011, and then it began to slow down in the second half of 2011. In the early parts of 2012, it looked like the economy might be stalling, and so it might be an incumbent unfriendly moment. President Obama issued the first, and 2 years later, before the 2014 elections, he issued the second of an executive order that legalized, in one case, about 800,000 people, and in the second case, a group of about 5 million people, in a way that he himself had described as lawless. And the courts agreed, by the way. The 2012 measure is still on the books, but the 2014 measure was thrown out by district courts, circuit courts, and then by a 4-4 decision of the United States Supreme Court. Why is that so important? That issue, that sense that the barriers of the country were down, was a powerfully animating force in the Donald Trump campaign. That's obvious. After it was all over, after the campaign ended and Donald Trump was elevated to the presidency, the immigration debate was reported on according to a certain convention. This is the way we would write about it. If you could identify that the person complaining about mass migration had somehow been an economic loser, their wages had been impinged on, or they'd been crowded out of an emergency room, then the complaint was fair. If it was about money, you could complain. If it was a sense of cultural displacement, or loss of power, or status, or prestige, absolutely out of bounds. And if it was a sense of, I'm a citizen, and it means something, then you're dealing with a racist or a crank or worse. One of the things that, as we contemplate the strength of democracy and this vulnerability of democracy, we have to take more seriously, in my opinion, than we have done, the connection that was argued in the 19th century between the nation state and democratic modes of government. We have not found a way, and I don't think we ever will, to do democratic government in any way other than through nation states. Nation states made of citizens, nation states with borders. The nation state did not have a very good run in the period from 1914 to 1945, and not even, and better, but still in many ways to be left something to be desired run from 1945 to 1989. And so many people of goodwill saw the answer to the problems of our time was to weaken the nation state in favor of broader attachments to humanity. What we discovered instead, as we've dissolved it, what we are discovering is that people do not move from citizenship bonds to broader bonds, but to narrower bonds, to ethnicity and to race. And that is what is happening in Europe, and that is what is happening here. Our topic today is what is to be done, and there's a lot to be said. But I think a new politics of the center meets the slogan, America first, with all its ugly associations, with a doctrine of Americans first. And that means doing some things that draw from the traditional political left, that is strengthening the material connections between citizens and state, in particular by re-thickening the social welfare state in the American context, especially in the area of health. But it also means strengthening the idea of citizenship by putting citizenship first and drawing more sharply the line between those who belong to the polity and those who don't, those who have entered the polity in legitimate ways and those who have sought entry in illegitimate ways, and enforcing that barrier to make it clear to all that the people who have done well in a world in which fewer and fewer do well still remember the people who have not done so well. Thank you.
Tom, yeah.
So Tom and I are going to switch
Okay.
orders, and I'm going to be the first person after Emily to do something unprecedented, which is sit here and give my comments, because my 2-year-old jumped on me and has thrown my bat. So the comments that both Tom and I are going to make are based upon a paper and book that we have been working on concerning the legal and constitutional predicates of democratic backsliding. Our comparative advantage is as lawyers, and in particular as comparative constitutionalists. Tom is a political scientist. They won't even let me play one on TV. The question that I want to ask, or that I will ask in my comments, is how does the US Constitution of 1787 meet or not meet the threat of democratic backsliding? And we know a little bit about the nature of that threat by looking comparatively at Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, Turkey, and seeing the legal and institutional pathways along which backsliding proceeds in those jurisdictions, and then asking, are those pathways available in the United States given the current constitutional setup? And in brief, we're pessimistic, and I will do the pessimism, Tom will do the optimism. Okay, why look at constitutional law? Well, when you write down a constitution, what you are doing is drawing a blueprint for institutions that are supposed to channel and manage political conflict. And they're supposed to do that not just today, but for the foreseeable future. They're supposed to do that under conditions of exogenous constraint and shock, under new geopolitical, new economic, new social conditions, right? They are supposed to provide the means to solve political conflicts. They're supposed to provide the means to solve flaws in the original constitutional document. What this means is that constitutions have to be designed to meet a range of political risks, not just one kind of political risks, but a wide variety of them that come at institutions in many different ways and that can derail institutions in many different ways. An implication of that is that when you design a constitution, you have to make trade-offs between different kinds of risk management. And so in thinking about the ways the Constitution addresses the problem of backsliding risk, one has to think about it in relation to and in terms of trade-offs with other kinds of risk management. So here's an example. Emergency powers are often thought of as an instrument for democratic backsliding. The Constitution addresses emergency powers by basically saying nothing about them. Rather, emergencies in the American context are dealt through aggressive and ambitious readings of ambiguous statutory texts, and we have an awful lot of vague statutory texts on the book, and creative exploitation of very, very abstract constitutional provisions. This means that presidents have an awful lot of leeway when it comes to emergencies, which means they can, in practice, violate many liberty, privacy, and bodily integrity interests. But it's very difficult for them to say, this is an emergency so severe that I must break the chain of democratic continuity. So our Constitution, by taking a response to emergencies that involve silence, accentuates the risk of individual rights violations, but it buys a measure of safety for democracy. That's an example of the kind of trade-offs that constitutions make all the time. And it's important to remember that constitutions, including ours, are almost always written under circumstances of great strain. Limited time, limited attention. The threat of civil war or violence looms on the horizon, right? Constitutions are not only have to make trade-offs, but those trade-offs are going to be imperfect. They're not going to be optimal. Our own constitution, right? If you're going to be pessimistic about constitutions in general, well, you should be really pessimistic about our constitution. Why? Our constitution is the oldest still operative organic document. It is 231 years old. 230 years old, sorry. It is 100 years older than the light bulb. It is 51 years older than the telegraph. It is roughly contemporaneous to James Watt's steam engine. It is a quill in an age of smart book styluses. There is no reason to think that it is well adapted to the particular forms of risk that present to constitutional democracies today. So let me be more specific about that. In our article in our book, we argue that there are basically two kinds of backsliding, fast, slow. We think that fast backsliding has more or less not completely gone away, but the risk has diminished over time. We think that the risk of slow backsliding, of an erosion of democracy, is a substantial one. And we think that there are 5 mechanisms through which it happens. The Constitution does reasonably well on 1 of 5 and pretty much flunks on the other 4. So let's start with the one on which it does reasonably well on. This is the question of amendment. In Hungary, as we've heard, and many other jurisdictions, would-be autocrats or competitive autocrats have changed the text of the Constitution as a way of limiting political competition and eroding competing institutional checks. Our Constitution, Article 5, has one of the most difficult to navigate amendment mechanisms in the world today. This means that it is very hard for an Orban, for a president here to do what Orban did in Hungary, change the text of the constitution to entrench himself or his party. On the other hand, it also means that there's no real way to clarify that the pardon power doesn't include a power to pardon yourself. There's no real way to clarify that there is no constitutional right to an automatic assault weapon or to a bump stock, right? So for all the good that comes from Article 5 in terms of mitigating backsliding risk, there's an awful lot of other stuff that we live or die with. Second institutional check, or second pathway, concerns checks and balances, and the role played in particular by the legislature and by the courts in limiting presidential aggrandizement and usurpation of democracy. In the US system, a president acting with authoritarian impulses, when backed by a partisan-aligned Congress, has very few legal limits on the ability, or faces very few legal constraints on his or her ability to dismantle either legislative constraints, such as congressional committee oversight, or judicial constraints. It is often forgotten that judicial independence and the effective operation of the courts as a check upon presidential authority is not necessarily a matter of constitutional text. It is a matter of convention. There is nothing in the Constitution that says that a president has to obey a federal court order. And there is a live academic debate in the law schools about when and how an order has to be obeyed by the president. I disagree here a little bit with Daniel Ziblatt's terrific comments earlier today, insofar as I think that to the extent that the separation of powers fails, this failure is a very old one. Madison initially imagined the branches as acting on the basis of institutional loyalties. He imagined them engaging in this kind of tooth and claw conflict, which through some unstated invisible hand mechanism would lead to constrained government. But within the first 10 years of the Constitution's operation, Madison, along with Jefferson and Adams, had built the first party system, a party system that meant that partisan motivations overcame quickly institutional loyalties. Okay, very quickly, the three last measures. Many other constitutions contain intra-branch as well as inter-branch checks. They contain institutions like civil service protections, like ombudsman or inspector generals. Our legal system has those institutions. We've seen, for example, the Office of Governmental Ethics being very effective, the Congressional Budget Office in some way being very effective. But none of them are constitutionalized. None of those protections of the integrity of the bureaucratic rule of law are embedded in our Constitution. Hence, we've already seen proposals to repeal the Hatch Act. We've seen a return to the Holman Rule, which allows congressional majorities to zero out particular bureaucrats' salaries. Fourth pathway. The deconstruction of the public sphere. Now, many Americans, if you ask them, would say we have a robust First Amendment. And it's certainly true. The First Amendment protects against the aggressive use of libel law in the way that we've seen in places like Turkey and Russia. On the other hand, the First Amendment conceptualizes the threat to the democratic public sphere as purely a matter of prohibitions that the government imposes upon speech. When it comes to, for example, the government's effort to regulate, let's say, fake speech, or false news, or to curate journalistic ethics, the Constitution affirmatively stands in the way of such efforts. And the Constitution has nothing to say about when and how the government does or does not speak. The Constitution has nothing to say about intimidatory government speech. It has nothing to say about false government speech. It has nothing to say about the obligation of governments to disclose certain information. To the contrary, to the extent that we have a jurisprudence on that point, it is a jurisprudence which favors governmental exclusion. The final point concerns partisan competition and the quality and the preservation of that partisan competition. Whereas other countries have special courts that are devoted to the protection or the adjudication of disputed elections, whereas other countries have dedicated, insulated election management bodies, what does the Constitution do? Article 1, Section 4 delegates to the states. Hence we have North Carolina. Hence we have a ramshackle uneven, haphazard system of electoral administration that is, as we have found out, intensely vulnerable to foreign nations' hacking. So along 4 out of 5 metrics, we think the Constitution supplies very little protection against the means of democratic backsliding that are observed in other jurisdictions. So given the right political conjunction, such backsliding is not just possible, it's eminently legal.
Great, so that was the bad news. So what do the following people have in common? Rand Paul, Al Sharpton, the Koch brothers, retired Justice John Paul Stevens, and Fox News commentator Marty Levin. Anyone know? They've all called at one time or another for an Article 5 convention here in the United States. And for those who don't know, we all learned in civics about the way the Constitution is amended, 2/3 of each House of Congress, 3/4 of the states. There is an alternative, never used mechanism, which is that 2/3 of state legislatures can call on Congress to call a new constitutional convention. In 2014, Michigan became the 34th state to issue some such call. No convention has yet issued. There's issues about counting. Some of these calls are restricted to something like a balanced budget amendment, or on the left side, on the sort of Democratic side, Rhode Island's is limited to talking about overturning Citizens United, campaign finance. So you have different calls for different things. And there's lots of legal questions, of course, because the Constitution is 230 years old, ambiguous, and none of these issues have ever been decided. Can a convention be limited? You may or may not know that of course, in 1787 in Philadelphia, was supposed to be a limited convention to amend the Articles of Confederation, and became a runaway convention. And it's actually for this reason that I myself am very skeptical that much good would come of this effort, and so I'm not a big supporter. But I guess the question one has to ask is, suppose it happens. What should we do? Or more generally, what would a new country just emerging on the stage that is concerned with this issue of constitutional and democratic erosion, what kind of institution should they choose? And, it's a kind of intensely Madisonian proposition, actually. The Founding Fathers were dedicated empiricists. And when they were writing the product that we so celebrate, they went out and looked all over the world. They sort of tried to absorb all available knowledge. And so in some sense, you can imagine, James Madison and Al Sharpton and, Rand Paul and all those guys sitting in a room, what would they come up with? So here, I think what they would do is they'd look around, right? And so there have been, by my count, I work on something called the Comparative Constitutions Project, 800 or 900 new constitutions written for all the different countries in that time. And the modal one drawn today looks very little like that of the United States. Lots of technological developments have happened. It's not the quill anymore, right? It's the stylus. And thus, there are things to learn from these other countries. So I'm just going to go through a few of the institutions. What are the things we are lacking if we were to start over? Well, one that Aziz mentioned in passing is, of course, neutral institutions to run elections. Something like 45% of national constitutions have an electoral commission that's constitutionally protected, that's formed in an independent manner. And actually, 13 American states have similar kinds of commissions to draw the boundaries. Now, for reasons he mentioned, there's constitutional restrictions on adopting a national statute to make every state do that. But that seems like something that would be good to do. In the United States, we know that those states that have those neutral electoral commissions have more competitive elections, more responsive policies to the electorate. That's been shown by political scientists, and so that seems like something we would seriously consider. A second important category of things is institutions of horizontal accountability, right? So the average constitution drawn today will have 3 or 4 other constitutional institutions that are produced independently, that are protected from political manipulation, that do particular tasks. A Human Rights Commission, a Counter-Corruption Commission, Ombudsman. In South Africa, these are called Chapter 9 institutions. There's a whole bunch of them listed in Chapter 9 of the Constitution. One of them, the Public Protector, is the institution which issued the report on Jacob Zuma spending all that money on his house. And, you know, South Africa is a kind of backsliding democracy, I think would be a charitable way to put it. But Zuma had to pay back that money. So even in that kind of context, a one-party state, more or less, with a powerful, charismatic guy, you know, you're able to have some accountability. And so I think that's a set of institutions we'd consider. One way to think about it is that the more institutions, the harder it is for a single party to take them all over. So there's more likely to be some institution to sort of pull the fire alarm and inform the public about malfeasance. Protecting the civil service, another thing we see in many constitutions, civil service commissions, explicit statements about the state itself. And you know, this is something we completely lack, as Aziz has cataloged, and something that I think we would certainly consider. And you know, there's maybe some statutory improvements that we could do even short of constitutional amendment. You know, another trend around the world is one that I think we were really at the forefront of. It's what's called judicialization, the transfer of policy decisions from legislatures, from the executive branch towards courts. And it's, you know, been a massive development and trend in both democracies and autocracies over the last couple of decades. And, you know, it's something that I certainly celebrated at one time. We thought, well, the judges are independent. They're sort of constrained by professional norms. That's a good thing. Of course, you know, that anytime you have an institution which is powerful, it invites capture. And that's exactly what we heard this morning has happened in Poland and Hungary. It's the first institution that you go after if you are trying to erode your democracy is the courts, the monitors. And so that may, you know, suggest that courts are certainly no panacea and ought to be designed very carefully. Now, but in the United States, we face this problem, right? The stakes of this sort of unprecedented escalation in judicial appointments and such, the end of the filibuster. You know, this is because the stakes are so high with the Supreme Court justice. And, you know, a reform that many have talked about, including Justice Stevens, is reducing the term from a life term to something like 18 years or 14 years. You can come up with a number. And that would, of course, put us more squarely in the mainstream of other constitutions. There's no other country that has true life terms for Supreme Court or Constitutional Court justices. So that's certainly something I think we could learn from. Restoring the supermajority to the appointments process, and this is one of these things where it's hard to see how it would happen, how it would be incentive compatible, given that we've escalated. It's precisely what Daniel was talking about this morning. You know, that once you have an escalation, it's very hard to back off of, but it would be something that'd be worth restoring. Two other things. Protecting the public sphere. As Aziz said, you know, we lack the ability, and that's a good thing, to regulate many of the media and such. Although one thing I think is particularly important is, for other countries, maybe more than the United States, is the role of competition law with regard to the media. So there are many countries where there's, you know, one dominant media company that's owned by the president or something like that. Berlusconi was kind of a leader in this regard, and it's not uncommon. So that seems like something where you could, even in the United States, you could have vigorous antitrust enforcement or antitrust scrutiny without actually violating the First Amendment. Let's see. The other, I guess maybe I'll close with a comment about regime type, because it did come up this morning. The discussion about, so you're a new country. You're worried about retrogression. You have these big choices to make. Should we be presidential? Should we be parliamentary? Should we be semi-presidential? Arturo Valenzuela mentioned Juan Linz this morning, so it's worth revisiting this debate, which he, you know, pioneered 2 decades ago. And I've done some regressions on this and sort of analyzed it, and I have not been able to come up with results that suggest any one of these regimes is more vulnerable to retrogression. I mean, if you just think about the cases that are on everyone's mind, Venezuela is presidential, Hungary is parliamentary, Poland semi-presidential. There have also been near misses in each regime type where the system is pulled back from what appeared to be an erosion. Sri Lanka, pretty important case, where intra-party disputing, intra-party competition was what saved Sri Lanka from being governed by Rajapaksa for life. And so there's, you know, in my view, what we ought to be doing is thinking not so much about these grand regime types, but about mechanisms within executive-legislative relations that sort of are beneficial. And the one we talk about a lot in our book is opposition rights. So in many constitutional schemes, the opposition will have a right to chair certain committees in Parliament. For example, this scrutiny committee or the budget, budget oversight and spending. Well, that's something that could be done actually by congressional rule here in the United States. It's within our grasp to do things like that if we can simply organize the politics. And of course, that's not simple at all. I'm just going to close with one comment, which is all of these institutional designs. Anyone who studies institutions, knows that there's no panacea, right? Institutions do not produce outcomes, but they do shift incentives and act as nudges and can act as roadblocks. In this case, with regard to erosion, there is always the risk that if you're designing for one thing, you're going to exacerbate some other risk. So constitutional design to prevent democratic erosion might produce more gridlock and less, vigorous government, but to us that seems to be something worth considering at this particular moment in our history. Thanks.
I just want to start by saying that not many students of American politics have ever seriously considered threats to the durability of American governing institutions. Americanists have tended to worry a lot more about the tendencies towards gridlock and ungovernability than problems of tending towards autocracy. But recent U.S. politics has been enough to unsettle even the most complacent among us. And comparative work on democratization certainly shows that one cannot take the durability of democratic institutions for granted. How do I move forward? Nancy Bermeo identifies 3 varieties of backsliding that have emerged as common pathways to democratic breakdown since the end of the Civil War. End of the Cold War, sorry. Promissory coup, executive aggrandizement, and strategic election manipulation. Promissory coup is highly unlikely in the United States. Firm and long-standing civilian control of the military closes off this pathway. The more serious questions about possible democratic backsliding in the United States focus instead on executive aggrandizement and strategic election manipulation. Executive aggrandizement occurs when elected executives weaken checks on executive power. There's no question that the U.S. presidency has grown in power along with the rise of the administrative and national security state. Party polarization has also amplified presidential power in some respects. Congresses mired in partisan gridlock are less able to assert themselves legislatively, allowing presidents to make more use of their unilateral powers. But just as the U.S. presidency has grown in power, so too has the power of the president's opponents. Party polarization means that presidents confront a more tightly organized opposition party in Congress and throughout the federal system. Most of the time, the president's party opposition controls Congress. U.S. national government has been divided 75% of the time since 1980. But even unified government does not guarantee a president will get his way with Congress. The means by which members of Congress are elected makes congressional parties far less hierarchical than parliamentary parties. The federal system also usually operates so that presidents face a substantial number of states controlled by their party opposition. State governments have numerous tools to block or dilute national policies because state cooperation is usually needed for implementation. In countries where executive aggrandizement has occurred, it has often proceeded via democratic means, through national elections, referenda, legitimate lawmaking processes. There's little prospect for strengthening the American presidency via these pathways. It's hard to imagine a president of the United States garnering the kind of support that would be required to make major institutional changes. The barriers to constitutional amendment in the U.S. are obviously extraordinarily high. But even regular legislation rarely proceeds by simple majority. Very little legislation passes on narrow party lines. This figure shows the average percentage of minority party members voting in support of the legislation that successfully passes the Senate. The data start with the 93rd Congress of 1973-74 and move through to 2013-2014. You can see that the average rarely dips below 50%, meaning that most legislation, including most of Mayhew's landmark laws, garners majority support from both parties. The same is also true in the House. Even in the polarized era, very little legislation passes Congress on party line votes. There's no trend towards more legislation passing by party line votes. Presidents can rarely command the kind of broad political support they would need to assemble supermajorities to enhance their powers. All the recent presidents have won office by slim margins by historical standards. This figure shows the winning presidential candidate's share of the Electoral College. There has not been a landslide presidential election in American politics since 1984, when Ronald Reagan won a national majority of 58.8%. For the past decade, presidents have spent much of their terms near or below 50% approval in public opinion polls. The difficulties of consolidating national power in U.S. politics have been on clear display since the 2016 elections. President Trump has been impeded at every turn, despite unified control. 9 months into his term of office, no major legislation has passed. A large share of executive offices remain unfilled. Federal courts have blocked or limited major executive orders. Unified party control has not spared the president a serious bipartisan investigation of Russian intervention in the elections, nor the appointment of a special counsel to investigate the matter. A president in his first year in office is usually at the peak of his power. As with most presidents, Trump's political capital will almost certainly decline over time. Republicans are virtually assured of seat losses in the 2018 midterm elections that will further reduce the president's leverage. A second form of Democratic backsliding, strategic election manipulation, denotes a range of actions aimed at tilting the electoral playing field in favor of incumbents. United States electoral law and procedures are hardly free of this kind of deck stacking. The political interests of incumbents and majority parties unquestionably shape rules regarding voter registration, ballot access, campaign finance, legislative districting, and government ethics. Strategic election manipulation poses a reduced threat at the federal level, however, simply because national power over elections is so limited. Voting procedures and voter registration, legislative districting, and ballot access are all almost entirely regulated at the state and local levels. In states where one party is dominant, the majority party may adopt rules that are favorable to its interests, but majority party strength varies considerably across states. Parties can use this kind of deck stacking in states where they are already strong, but they have difficulty doing so in swing states or states that lean towards the opposing party. It's not to say it's impossible, as the Wisconsin example illustrates, but the state-by-state nature of these institutional battles limits opportunities for a national party to insulate itself from electoral tides, and it frustrates efforts at election manipulation at the federal level. If we define populism, as Anna GB does, as an anti-elite movement that expresses the general will of an organic and wholesome people, then I would rate populism as a more serious threat to American liberal democracy than any slide towards autocracy. Scholars of American public opinion have long known that the values undergirding liberal democracy are fragile at the grassroots. Americans are often unwilling to apply the abstract civil libertarian principles they espouse to specific unpopular or threatening groups. Authoritarian and ethnocentric beliefs are important drivers of public opinion. Long before the anti-establishment fervor of the 2016 elections, Hibbing and Tice Morse wrote 2 books documenting the extent to which Americans embrace populist notions of an organic and wholesome people in contradistinction to an out-of-touch political elite. In the data they report, majorities of respondents exhibit little understanding of the sources of conflict in Congress and impatience with debate and deliberation. Frustrated with the contentiousness of real-world democracy, they report surprising percentages of people respond favorably to the mention of decision-making structures that are not democratic, such as turning government over to successful business people. America's longstanding openness to populism becomes more troubling for liberal democracy during a time when the party system is becoming increasingly racialized. Even as early as 1989, Huckfeld and Cofield wrote a book about how race was driving out class as the most significant factor in electoral politics. Since 1989, the American electorate has become more racially and ethnically diverse, and the diversity gap between the parties has grown progressively wider. The data displayed here from a 2017 Pew Research Center report shows demographic change in the parties between 1992 and 2016. As you can see, the Democratic Party is becoming more diverse at a faster rate than the country as a whole, while Republicans are becoming more diverse at a slower rate. Recent work by Michael Tesler has shown that white voters' attitudes towards race have become a stronger predictor of their partisan attachments. These racial differences between the parties are starkly reflected in Congress, where minorities make up fully 39% of Democratic members, but only 5.5% of Republican members. A racialized party system in an electorate with questionable commitment to liberal values is a troubling development. It's not easy to manage racial tensions in a democracy in any case, much less when race becomes a principal line of political cleavage. Americans who would respond favorably to a more racialized, populist form of politics may be an underserved constituency. Political elites are the traditional bulwark of liberal democracy. In that vein, mainstream politicians have tended to steer clear of explicitly racial appeals. But the gap between regular voters and the political elite on this dimension can present opportunities for ambitious politicians, particularly in times of low trust in government. Should politicians activate such cleavages, there's no guarantee that party gatekeepers can stop such candidates from winning nominations or taking control of the party, just as Republicans could not stop the nomination of Trump, nor more recently the Senate nomination of Roy Moore. The 2016 elections suggest a possible future, in which American democracy might become more populist and less racially inclusive. Over the course of his campaign, Trump violated the norms of liberal democracy in numerous ways. In violating these norms, Trump was able to offer primary voters a product that other Republican elites refused to supply. Giving voice to such sentiments may have allowed him to forge a unique bond of trust and authenticity with the party base. It seems almost certain that Trump's example will point the way to other ambitious politicians seeking advancement in the future. So as we take stock of the prospects for democratic backsliding in the United States, the more serious vulnerabilities center on liberal democratic norms rather than on executive aggrandizement or election manipulation. Whatever its failings in other respects, the Madisonian system thwarts concentration of power. But populism, a mindset with deep roots in American public opinion, threatens the norms of multi-ethnic liberal democracy in the United States as it does elsewhere.
Thank you very much. David Frum very wisely opened by making himself popular by telling some very good jokes in order to create the space to then make himself unpopular by challenging the audience with views probably a lot of people didn't agree with. I want to do the inverse of that, which is that I'm going to unwisely start by making myself unpopular and then hopefully try and butter you up at the end. So this session is called Can It Happen Here and What Can We Do About It? And one of my sort of things I noticed, throughout this really great conference is that this is sort of always how these things tend to go. I've been to a lot of these things over the past year, none as eminent and erudite as this. But there's always sort of a bit at the end, which is like, okay, and perhaps we should sort of kind of think about what to do about it. And I think that that's a shame, that it shouldn't be half of the last panel, and that, we're stepping outside of our comfort zone in general, I think, as scholars, by taking on more public work, as a lot of people in this room have over the course of the last year and so on. But I think we should step out of our comfort zone but one step further by taking seriously our task, not just to give a diagnosis of what's happening, but to actually apply our expertise and our academic knowledge to figuring out what to do about it in a serious way and not as an afterthought. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of that in 8 minutes, but I feel like that is a conversation. We now have a really rich, robust conversation about what's going on, and I don't think we have the same rich, robust conversation about what to do. So I think my suggestions might end up being a little amateurish, but I think that's because we need to have more of a real academically founded debate in that area. So that's sort of my challenge to start off with. Okay, so to know what we can do about it, we do have to understand a little bit about whether it can happen here and what's going on. Very briefly, I think there's 3 basic scenarios of what Trump is going to do to the American Republic. I think we've spent a lot of time talking about the first one, which is how likely it is or is not that Trump sort of outright destroys it, right? And I think that we are nearly approaching, insofar as that's possible, at a conference with sort of 23 excellent speakers. We're actually sort of in a broad space of agreement on that, I have the impression, which is to say that, yes, there are things that can really be dangerous to the American Republic. We shouldn't be complacent. The Constitution is not somehow inviolable and magic, but it doesn't look as though Donald Trump is about to destroy it sort of tomorrow, right? That's partially, frankly, because he's not as strategic as some other authoritarian populists that we've seen rise in other countries. He doesn't quite seem to have the political discipline or perhaps the political skill and acumen of a Viktor Orban or of a Lech Kaczynski. I also agree with that assessment. I don't think it looks like Trump is destroying democracy, but I just want to sound one important note of caution, which is that most scholars of Russia didn't really think that Vladimir Putin was going to completely destroy the democratic system there. A lot of scholars of Turkey thought 2 or 3 or 4 years into Recep Erdogan's rule that things were going fine. Scholars were a little worried about Orban, but at the beginning they didn't think that he was destroying democracy in Hungary. And even most scholars of Poland, for they were very worried about the peace victory in 2015, were quite insistent that democracy was going to be able to defend itself. So, we're less than a year into the Trump presidency, and our track record isn't great at predicting those things. Now, I still think it doesn't look like he's destroying democracy, but I think we should at least keep in our mind the fact that we've been wrong about similar kinds of things in other countries. Okay, so what's the second scenario? The second scenario is the super optimistic scenario, right? Trump is about to fail, he'll get impeached, or he'll resign, or he'll just lose disastrously in 2020. And there'll be a sort of moment of coming together. We'll realize that this is all a terrible nightmare. People who I've been writing about who are sort of disengaged from democracy and a little critical of it realize that it's important to live in a democracy, that you don't want to have a strongman leader, and everything will be great. We haven't talked much about that scenario today. I think mostly because people think it's self-evidently out of bounds. I don't see the makings of that, right? I mean, the degree of partisanship we now have, the degree of anger we have at our politics, and the degree of long-term structural drivers of the rise of populism we have are broad enough and deep enough that it doesn't look like we're going to have that kumbaya moment, even if Trump wins. Timur Kuran, for example, had some very interesting remarks about what would actually happen, and Adam Pravorsky as well, what would actually happen if Trump lost. It's not obvious that we would then be out of the woods. So that leaves a third kind of possibility, and it's a possibility that has been haunting me for the last months. I call it the sort of ancient Rome scenario. There's other historical metaphors for it, right? But when you think of Trump not as some of his favorite presidents like Jackson, but if you think of him as something like the Gracchi, a moment of norm disruption, a moment of real conflict between an elite and people who sort of want to overthrow it, and it starts to break down some norms and so on. you manage to get relatively mainstream politicians back into power for a little bit, but the actual underlying drivers of this haven't gone away. And so over a course of 50 or 60 years, you keep having similar movements come back to power, and eventually they've really managed to erode the institutions and the norms sufficiently for the system to break down. I think that, to me, what keeps me up at night at this point is that scenario. Okay, so what can we do in order to stop that scenario? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that that scenario is being driven by some deep structural factors, right? I mean, in ancient Rome, this was a question of land reform and some real economic and social transformations that the old ancient Roman Republic had trouble dealing with. And I think we have a similar set of things here. In very brief, it seems to me there's three big transformations that are going on, three ways in which the stability of democracy in the past cannot predict stability now because the circumstances have changed, because we don't live in the same world as 50 years ago. So the first of those is economic. From 1935 to 1960, the living standard of the average American doubles. From 1960 to 1985, it doubles again. Since 1985, it's been flat. That radically transforms how people think about politics. They used to never particularly love politicians, particularly trust politicians, but give them the benefit of the doubt. And now they're saying, I'm not getting anything out of this, let's throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks. The second thing, and I agree with the people who are pointing out that these are not rival, that the world is not monocausal, is about race and ethnicity, right? This is something that's very obvious in Western Europe with the rise of populist movements, where you had these deeply mono-ethnic and monocultural countries which had a very exclusionary understanding of what a real Pole, a real Hungarian, a real German, a real Swede is. And they're slowly starting to transform those as you have mass immigration. In the United States, we've always had a multi-ethnic society, but one with a strict racial hierarchy. And we're slowly starting to overcome that. And again, it is the case that some people welcome that and embrace that. I think a lot of people in this room do. But some people are very resentful to that, and that is one of the deeper drivers of this. And then the third thing that underlines all of this and gives it additional force and additional bite is the arrival of social media and new technologies, which I think we should understand as closing the gap between political and financial and economic elites and the rest of society. That's great in authoritarian regimes, gives us a lot of ability for democratic movements to oppose them, but it can be dangerous in democratic regimes. It does overcome some real problems, but it means that it's much easier for fake news, for hate speech, and so on to spread. And so what we're facing is this mix of these three things. Okay, so what can we do about those things? Well, the first thing to do, by the way, is simply to get involved in politics and to encourage other people to get involved in politics. One thing we've learned from a lot of the countries we've been talking about today is that when you manage to beat populists at the polls, they don't have a chance to erode the constitution. And even once they're in government, if you beat them at the first opportunity you have, you probably retain sort of a chance to do it. But the longer they are in power, the more they can erode the system and the less even the playing field becomes. So actually getting involved in politics and getting engaged in politics is one obvious thing that all of us in this room can do and that we can encourage other people to do. Okay. There also needs to be some more policy responses, some more structural things. In my mind, it's clear that if the economic trends of the last 30 years go on for the next 50, democracy is toast. Adam Przeworski was reflecting in a very interesting way on his own research and his famous papers from the 1990s and saying, well, perhaps the present is not like the past. I think there's a real question about whether what you need is $14,000 GDP per capita in order to be stable, which was Argentina in the 70s and so on, or whether what you need is an ongoing improvement in living standards. We don't have any historical precedent for a democracy that doesn't experience improvements in living standards and is stable for decades on end. So I think we need to think seriously about a set of economic policies that embraces globalization and the benefits that come from it, that embraces free market and the benefits that come from it, but that takes seriously the task of giving average citizens hope for the future and improving their living standards. The second thing is about identity. And I think it's really important for us to fight for a vision of a multi-ethnic society. And I think that involves actually a dual fight. It obviously involves a fight against the white nationalism of the right, and some of its enablers who are now sitting in the White House. But I think it also involves us putting forward a notion, and here's the old political theorist in me speaking perhaps, a notion of what it can be for us to actually build a multi-ethnic society together and for us to see what we have in common across racial and religious lines, rather than just what divides us. I think at this point it's very tempting for us to only speak about injustice and discrimination, and we obviously have to address those things and obviously have to fight against those things. But I think we also have to offer a vision for what it would look like for us to have something in common and to fight for those ideals and to domesticate nationalism. Rather than leaving the field of nationalism to the right to be exploited by white nationalists, I think we have to build an inclusive patriotism that can occupy that space. I think of nationalism as a half-domesticated animal, and it's always going to remain dangerous, but we have to do our best to domesticate it, because otherwise the other guys are going to go and exploit it and turn it into a raging bull. The third thing is about social media. Now, there's some things we can do in terms of persuading Facebook and Twitter to change their algorithms. There may be some things we can do legally, for that's obviously very difficult in the United States because of the First Amendment, and I think that's by and large a good thing. But what we can do, if we can't do so much about the supply side of hateful ideas on the internet, we can take much more seriously our obligation to influence the demand side. And one of the things this means is to fight in a proud way for the ideals of liberal democracy. We have this huge glaring premise all of today that liberal democracy is a good thing, that it's worth defending, that has framed every intervention, but we rarely talk about those things. And we rarely think about those things, by the way, in our teaching. When you think about the number of people that the people in this room reach, and the number of people that the people in this room reach, it is a vast number of people. And I think we need to challenge ourselves in the other hat that we wear as scholars, which is to say, as teachers, how we can once again live up to the ideals of our founding fathers, I say as a new American citizen, and by the way, every political thinker from Plato to Aristotle and from Machiavelli to Rousseau, of turning children into citizens, of turning the next generation into people who actually defend the political institutions. That is not how we think of our job as academics. And frankly, I think it should be. Now, I said that I would try and butter up the audience and the organizers at the end. I think we have come a long way in the last year. I think academia has become a less quietist place. I think political scientists have started to understand that we have civic obligations that aren't rival to our duties as scholars. They're coterminous, or there's a Venn diagram or something like that, but they're not rival with each other. And I really do think that both this conference is a great sign of that, and Bright Line Watch is a great testament to that. So I think we can pat ourselves on the back for a little bit, and we can certainly applaud the organizers of this conference for a moment. But we also need to take seriously where we're still falling short and where there's still more things that we can do to actually try and defend our institutions. Thank you.
So thank you, one and all. What we're going to be doing now for the next 35 minutes is we're going to start. I'm going to have a question for the panel. And while I'm doing that, we're going to be collecting up written questions for the panel. And I will pick on them with a strong bias towards legibility. So while that's going on, are you going to pick up somebody picking up the questions? I've got some here. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Okay. So I've found all of the presentations thought-provoking, and I wanted to start from the observation that David and Yascha both made explicitly, but was implicit in the comments of many other people, that before talking about backsliding and ways of stopping backsliding, we should think about what's producing the phenomenon in the first place, because otherwise the solutions might not be getting to the problem. And as I listened to the various speakers, a number of them had things to say about that. Julia was talking about disrupting the racial order as an underlying phenomenon. David himself was talking about migration as threatening people and precipitating a lot of the politics we've seen. Aziz and Tom focused on an obsolete constitution, and Francis focused on populism, particularly populism that incorporates race and racism. And Yascha focused on economic stagnation, racial integration, multiculturalism, and all that, and social media. And I think there's a lot to be said about a lot of those things, but it seems to me that there is kind of elephant in the room that's not being talked about, that somewhat touched on by Yascha's talk about economic stagnation. But I want to really push the panelists a little further to what's really behind that, and how might we think about political reforms that can address what's really driving this problem. And I think that the way I would my path into this, and this is what I'm going to throw out to the panelists to comment on, that really it's not the absence of upward mobility or improvement. It's a bleaker thing that I think we know from Kahneman and Tversky and others that experiencing losses or the fear of loss is a much more potent motivator of people than foregone gains. And I think that loss and fear of loss can trump just about anything in politics. And I think that that's a very important thing to think about. And what I'm thinking here again is just think about make America great again. In a Kahneman Tversky sense, is a brilliant slogan because it right there communicates something has been taken away from you and I'm going to bring it back, as opposed to America's best days are ahead or something like that. It's a framing effect that focuses people's attention on something that they have lost. And I think that the real issue is wage stagnation, real wage declines for many of the people who have been mobilized to support Trump. So I think everybody should read, for instance, and I apologize if this was brought up earlier while I was doing my day job, but 3 books everybody should read. One is Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, an ethnographic study of Tea Party people in Louisiana that was done over 5 years before Trump came along. And she added a chapter about Trump at the end. Kramer, Catherine, I think it is Kramer, Politics of Resentment, a book about Wisconsin. Again, white working class, rural Wisconsin. Again, a 5-year ethnographic study of the politics of resentment based on disappearing jobs, collapsing communities, the anticipation that it's only going to get worse into the future. And then for an autobiographical account of the same thing, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, which is about Tennessee and Ohio. Again, an account of devastated communities, jobs having completely disappeared, massive drug addiction through all generations, collapsing families. And you read these 3 books and you understand why the Democrats focus on things like transgender bathrooms alienated these people. So I think that What's driving this, of course, is the disappearance of employment, and certainly the disappearance of employment that was reasonably well paid by the standards with which these people had been living and were expecting to live into the future, and the disappearance of employment security. So even the people who have jobs have few expectations of keeping them for very long, or at least keeping them at the same wages for very long. And so it seems to me that unless a political system can find a way to address that, it's very unlikely that changing the Constitution in various ways, or focusing on the other things that people have brought up that are no doubt important, but it doesn't seem to me that we're going to get very far. So what I would ask the panelists to speak to is, to the extent that this is the underlying problem that's generating the kind of politics that we're seeing, what are the failures in the political system that are hampering the capacity to address that, and what can we do about that? So I will collect up questions from the audience while anybody who wants to address that can. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I guess so. I've been thinking a lot about this, and you've described a substantial portion of my syllabus in your book recommendations. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I don't really want to answer so much as I want to push back on this with recognition that everything I know about democratic theory I learned from someone in this room. Ian, Sue Stokes, I see Brian Garston back there. But now I'm going to push back. So I think if the underlying cause of this were economic, then we would have seen Trump win the presidency in 2008. And I think if we look at U.S. history, this is what was so stunning to me about the realization about racial orders. We don't see these legitimacy challenges come up so much in response to serious recession. There were some during the Great Depression. We see them in response to race. And I think that's underlying the inability of the political system to address the economic problems that you described. So if we were to entertain your premise for a moment that is what's driving, particularly, we're talking about Trump, right? We're talking about Trump. If economic stagnation and lack of mobility is driving the Trump movement, if we accept that premise for a moment, then the question becomes why isn't there a political movement that unites different people who are facing these economic challenges? And the answer is there's not. And so I think that's, I guess I'm sort of pushing back to say I think that still the problem-solving mechanism, the not there is racial, and then the solution is economic, and so that's the logic of the problem. But now David's going to tell me why I'm wrong, I think.
No, I'm going to tell you that you're right. Look, obviously, economic stagnation, income stagnation is a very important part of where these movements come from. But I will note that the second best in the entire developed world, the country with the second best performance after Canada for its middle class is Germany. If you look at quintiles of income, the German middle quintile has done better than anybody's except Canada. And we've just seen a collapse of the German parties in the center and the rise of German parties of the extremist right and left in the wake of the biggest migration shock in German history. Probably you can cope with a lot of migration if your economies are doing great. And probably if your economies are not doing so great, and especially middle-income people are not good, and you restrict your immigration, you can buy some stability. It's the combination. I agree with Yascha, although I would refine with his three factors. It is economic stagnation for middle-income people, the increasing levels of ethnic diversity, so there's less social trust. And I would say instead of social media, I would point to the aging of the baby boom generation, which means that you have rising claims on resources, public and private, at the same time as you have fewer resources to go around and less willingness to share because of an increasingly diverse population. Basically, I see what political elites have been doing since about 2000 is applying a series of pain tests to their population. How much pain can we administer before you do something? We're going to take away your money. We're going to raise questions about the reliability of your pensions and health care, and we're going to change your countries in ways
you were never consulted about and that you're not going to like, and that we're going to call you names about if you object to them.
Francis.
I just want to say, as we reflect on what we can learn from the 2016 elections, is that it was a very normal election, that the demographic groups that supported the Republican Party, or supported Trump, were the same demographic groups that supported Romney. The demographic groups that supported Hillary Clinton were the same ones that supported Barack Obama. That 90% of self-identified Democrats supported Clinton, 90% of self-identified Republicans supported Trump. That as odd as Trump is in terms of his platform and what he was offering, the behavior of the American electorate was as if this was an entirely normal election. Now, we've paid a great deal of attention to that small but decisive increment of the vote that was key to Trump's victory, that namely the Rust Belt vote that was responsive to the Make America Great message, that liked his deviation from Republican orthodoxy on trade and immigration. But the outcome of this election was on a knife's edge. And that I think we shouldn't give undue weight, even though this increment of the population was important for the outcome of this particular election. There's no reason to conclude that they will similarly be decisive for future elections, that it's hard to predict what our politics will look like. But right now, for me, the main thing that stands out for the 2016 election is just the extent to which the pre-existing patterns that we'd seen in presidential elections for a long stretch of time continued to hold.
So a few thoughts. The first is that I'm a little skeptical about calling the 2016 election normal. Now, I know that there's some sort of very straightforward and obvious evidence for that, right? The thing that you didn't mention that is always listed in that same breath is that 97% of congressmen or something like that got reelected and so on. I do wonder, though, whether if a candidate like Donald Trump had somehow managed to run on the Republican ticket in 1980, he would have been able to keep so much of a coalition, right? So it's true that the coalition on which he won was in many ways a traditional Republican coalition, but the fact that he was able to win on that coalition, to me, seems like a sign of some very deep change. And so I think it's possible to acknowledge the points you just made and still preserve the thought that this is not a normal election. Now, I agree, though, with a few things. One is like when you think about how does Trump lose in 2020, and I think for anybody who cares about liberal democracy, that is something that we have to care about, and it's a strange thing to say at an academic conference, but I think that's obvious from everything we've talked about today. It's probably unwise to focus narrowly on the 80,000 voters that made Trump win the 2016 election. And that's in part because of the bigger demographic shifts you see in other countries, right? The strongest party among non-immigrant workers in Germany now is not the Social Democratic Party, it's not the Christian Democratic Party, it's the Alternative for Germany. The strongest party among white workers in France for a good while now has been the Front National. The strongest party among white workers in Austria is far-right populists. So I think most likely it's a question of stemming the bleeding in those groups of a population while winning over other populations. That's sort of my little piece of amateur campaign strategy, which nobody asked me to do. But to speak to the larger question, I think that there's sort of a couple of weird things in this debate, right? The first is this continual debate that is playing out at a really low intellectual level in the public media, but in an odd way, we are creating at a higher intellectual level here of, is it the economy or is it race? And I really do think that it's both. Now, in the economy, it's not how wealthy are you, but it is a lot of measures about how optimistic you are and how affluent the region you are in is and how many high-qualified people there are there, how likely it is that your jobs get automated, right? So it's slightly more sophisticated measure, which is obvious to us in the case of immigration, by the way. None of us say it can't be immigration because people in New York don't vote for Trump, right? So that point is obvious to us there and somehow not obvious to us in the economy. But I was speaking to a legislator and I think it really made it clear to me. And he said, look, 30 years ago when I asked people, who are you? They said, I'm a Teamster. right? Or I'm a foreman in the factory, right? They're identified by their job. They're identified by the earned identity. And as for all kinds of complicated reasons, a lot of them have lost access to that earned identity. You ask them now who they are, and they say, well, I'm white, and I don't like those people over there, right? And so I think the brew that goes into a political anger that often expresses itself in cultural and racial and sometimes racist terms can in part be economic. Now, the last thing I want to say, I know I've been hogging for a little bit, is that there's a sort of weird paradox to me in the public debate about the cultural side of this. And it's that the same people who are most prone to describing America as, in essence, in the end, a white nationalist nation, right, and in essence, really deeply marked by its racism, also tend to be the people whose prescriptions essentially is to double down on or to create a coalition of minorities. And that seems to me just really bizarre, because when you look at the patterns in the US electorate, it's true that the minority may eventually be the majority, but that's not going to be for some 30 years, even on the most optimistic scenarios, right? And so there's something really paradoxical to me about this, that either you think, and I'm thinking through this in this moment, I've never quite been able to put my finger on it, but either you think that America is deeply racist, and if you want to make sure that the racists aren't in charge, then you have to actually make your pitch on economic policy, because that's the only way that you can ever win, right? Or you have to think that no, most Americans are willing to be won over by an inclusive vision of a nation that also does something for them. And I think, given, if nothing else, what the rapport of forces in the electorate is, that's where we got to be. We got to build a coalition where we can talk about racial injustice and overcome discrimination, but also think very seriously about how to appeal to the people we need in order to build a winning coalition. And I see surprisingly few people being in that space, because they're either to the left of it or to the right of it.
We haven't talked too much, at least in this panel, about voting and who votes. And, you know, when we talk about building coalitions, that matters a great deal. While it is true that there is some overlap in the populations of people who vote and don't vote, it's also true, I think, that people who don't vote tend to be more interested in government intervention and government spending on things like healthcare. And so, you know, in the kind of frustration about, you know, essentially the white working class, right? The three books you mentioned are all about white people, and people of color in this country who have also dealt with, you know, lack of economic opportunity, have not gone in the same political direction. So we're talking about, you know, white people feeling this sense of loss and this sense of threat. And, you know, even in that population, there's a difference between people who vote and don't vote. And I'm not sure what to offer about this, because exhorting people to vote and participate in the political process doesn't seem to really yield higher amounts of participation in America. But it is really striking to me, as someone who follows civil rights issues, how much disenfranchisement is moving into the mainstream in American politics. You know, it is true that we've had people perpetuate myths about voter fraud before, but to have a vice presidential commission in which you have basically the four most extreme people in the country empowered to think about all the ways to use the power of the federal government not to enfranchise people, but to actually make it harder to vote. That's the kind of entrenchment of power that I think connects to Tom and Aziz's work, because it's about the Constitution and its, you know, failures as well as its strengths. We don't have a clear right to vote in the Constitution. There's nothing that says that we are supposed to prevent unnecessary restrictions on voting. And we don't, because of our amendment process, have a clear way to address that either. So that's a way, I think, in which the structural challenges intersect with these questions about coalition building.
Just to flag as an example of maybe the kind of politics that Yascha was talking about, we have had a successful left of center or centrist political movement in the country in the last 6 months. it's the movement to defend Obamacare. And it's a movement that succeeded in making it extremely difficult to enact legislation that stripped away a form of social provision that disproportionately benefits people of color. But it's a movement that in part succeeded paradoxically because we have an antiquated constitution that creates probably far too many veto gates for the optimal constitutional design, right? So it's I think that there's a lesson there to be had about the existence of imminent political coalitions of the sort that Yascha is talking about, but also the way that when one is thinking, if one is thinking with a political strategist hat on, one needs to account for the ways in which the institutional architecture does and does not create opportunities for mobilization and mobilization of different forms.
Okay, I have more questions here than will be addressed, particularly if we address them as comprehensively as we did the last one. But so this one was directed at David, but I actually think several of the panelists might have something to say about it. The way it was put in the one that was directed at David. How do we rebuild the bipartisan consensus around small d democratic norms? And a sub-question was, what's the scenario where internal GOP politics would facilitate that process, but also maybe internal Democratic Party politics might be added to that?
That's the ultimate question. And one of the, maybe before answering it, and I'll be brief, I invite people, and this is maybe a response to what Yascha just said, to ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish here? If what you're trying to accomplish is, how do we strengthen the left? That's one answer. If you're saying, how do we strengthen democratic norms? That's quite a different answer. And there's been a tendency to blur them. The way, I'm not a person of the left at all, so I'll just give you from my outsider's view. You want to strengthen the left? The way you do it is by ramping up, is by building up a coalition of minorities. That's the best democratic mobilization, build up racial antagonism, Black Lives Matter. Those, because the reason that the reason the 2016 election was abnormal was by the normal political science indicators, Hillary Clinton should have won 53% of the vote. The fact that she got 48 is abnormal. She lost 5 points in a very incumbent-friendly environment. Why? Failure to mobilize black voters, partly because of voter suppression, partly because she wasn't offering them much of anything. Medicare for all, that's how you build the left. But what you will discover when you do that is the candidates who lead that will be Trumps of the left. Not as gross.
Bernie
but,
Sanders, for example?
Like Bernie Sanders, who was good at his job, yeah. But those they will be norm tramplers. They will do things like Obama's executive actions in his second term. That's what you'll get. That is a way to a more social democratic United States. It'll be an ethnically driven way. If what you want to do, if your question is how do we build democratic norms, that's a different question. And then you have to say this is not about party advantage, and that means that some of the people you're going to have to address the things that are driving the corrosion of democratic norms. What do you think of this? You interview a voter, and you say, "Why did you vote for Trump?" And the voter said, "Well, I'm just really disappointed at what has happened to my personal living standard. I haven't had a wage increase in 20 years." You say, "You are so greedy and materialistic. Don't you understand that money is the root of all evil?" I conjure you, I order you to lay aside these crass, okay? But that is the sermon that they get if they say, I'm unhappy that my neighborhood, which used to be 100% English speaking, now has 30% English second language learners in my children's school. And that will happen. I went to a school in North Carolina when I was researching in 2007, where a family reported the change from no foreign language speakers to 30% over the course of their 3 children's time in that one school district. Find out what is bothering people, and do something about it, and take the grievances seriously. Joseph Schumpeter is deeply out of style, but had a big impact on me. It seems to me that democratic systems get into trouble in two ways. One is what populism is the people identify the problems and the people offer the solutions. Bad. Elitism is the people identify problems, the elites tell them they're wrong about them, and offer other problems and other solutions. Also bad. Listen to the problems, then use partisan competition to compete to offer responsible solutions, but do not read the problems out of court.
Anyone else want to pick up any of that?
Go ahead. Thanks.
Well, there's several questions that are basically about the connections between populism and presidentialism. To what extent are they some kind of, symbiotically, mutually encouraging, or one producing the other, or yeah.
I'm going to be very brief this time, but I'm going to make myself even more unpopular. If there's one thing that all of political scientists seem to agree on in the last 30 years is that it's all about institutions, right? And it's not clear to me in the case of populism that it is. Now, obviously, the particular way in which populism plays out in different countries is shaped by institutions. But when you look around these different contexts, what is striking is that populism has found a way of expressing itself, here through a presidential election, there through a party that's very strong in parliament, there through a popular referendum, across all of these very, very different institutional contexts. So while I think there's obviously things to be said about hyperpartisanship, about anger, about the fact that the political system is blocked because of all the veto powers and all of those things in the United States, what's striking to me when you look at an international perspective is how little of the experience and the variation of populism can be explained by institutions.
I'll just add, Viktor Orban, Erdogan came to power as prime minister. You go down the list. And so to me, what this suggests is that old debate, Juan Linz's question, actually, in some ways it was answered, I think, by Adam's student Zay Chebub. I don't know if he was your student, but he answered it about a decade ago, that it's not presidentialism or parliamentarism per se. There's selection issues which create the outcomes we see. And to me, that suggests a much more micro focus in terms of our research agenda.
Can I pop in? I wrote a book about mandates and presidential mandate claiming. And my argument in the U.S. context is that populism is a rhetorical strategy for presidents to deal with the legitimacy challenges to an incredibly powerful and problematic institution and the conditions of partisanship. So I think there's something separate there about populism as a rhetorical strategy.
Well, so here's one that. Oh, this one. This says it has David Frum's name at the top, but that may be a rhetorical slight. Making America great again would require strengthening the welfare state, which many voters interpret as giving handouts to blacks and Latinos. These voters are also the most vulnerable to anti-immigrant and xenophobic appeals. Would your concessions work? ?
One of the things I did not understand with the Hillary Clinton for president campaign was Hillary Clinton did endorse at one point the lowering of the Medicare age from, I think, what did she go to 55? Oh, sorry. Hillary Clinton did at one point endorse the lowering of the age for qualification for Medicare, I think to 55, I forget. That was one of her 972 policy proposals. And one of the things has always been a theory of mine about campaigns is if you have 972 policy proposals, you don't have any. If you have 4, you don't have any. If you have 2, you're testing people's memory. So if you, I think generally, I think you see throughout that the United States needs a thicker social insurance network. Europe needs a thinner one. We need ways of financing it that are not too provocative, and you need an offer. But the offer works because it's an offer to the polity. If the offer is to the planet, then the offer is going to break down of its own weight. So I think actually the two that when you talk about it, it is not that it is not a contradiction that you have a policy of thicker social insurance and higher borders. Those two go hand in hand. And that's one of the things, by the way, that people want to break the welfare state. They understand that very well. That's why you find libertarians are very committed to open borders, because they know with open borders, your welfare system, your social insurance system cannot work, and that's why they're in favor of it.
So a question for Emily and perhaps also Yascha, as it deals partly with social media. How can journalists deal with the particular challenges of covering the Trump presidency? A, that so much is happening, such that many important stories get neglected, and B, that Trump manages so often to dominate the news cycle with tweets that derail attention from substantive and timely issues.
Right. So sometimes it seems to me like Trump's main talent is that he has taken his reality television show and turned it into the news that we consume all the time that is inescapable. And there's a kind of fire hose. And in fact, there are all kinds of teasers, we'll see soon. He's sort of using all those strategies that served him in this different role to great effect. And it is a huge challenge for the media. We cover everything. It's just that people can't really keep up, and it becomes harder and harder to know what's important. The 972 points kind of hold in that era as well. One part of the media that I probably should have mentioned and didn't, it's obvious, is that, the right-wing media has taken on such a role in fueling social media, in covering the president in a different way. And I think that, again, that puts pressure on the mainstream media to become kind of a different animal in response in a way that we're not particularly well suited for. I do think one thing the mainstream media has been doing better at is covering fake news as opposed to ignoring it. Even last year, you see a fake news story, you just sort of like act as if that's you're not going to touch that, as opposed to realizing that it's out there being consumed and needs to be debunked. And it's always tricky. Debunking also, spreads misinformation too. But I think we're at the point, given how people are consuming news, how difficult it is to tell on Facebook whether the source you're looking at is credible or not, that the mainstream media has a responsibility to be engaging in these stories that we used to see as beneath us.
So I've been thinking through sort of the different notions of truth and lies we have, right? So there's this pair of concepts that were very popular a few years ago. So Stephen Colbert's truthiness and then Harry Frankfurt on bullshit, which was basically saying that the problem isn't anymore that there's sort of straightforward lies. The problem now is that people are just sort of indifferent to the truth, and we don't quite know how to deal with that. And that's different from the straightforward lie, because at least, this is Harry Frankfurt points, at least the liar pays a kind of tribute to the truth, right? I actually think that in retrospect is really naive. That compared to what we have now, that's sort of child's play. That what you see, and I think the first place where I observed it actually was Italy under Silvio Berlusconi, but I think Donald Trump is completely following that part of Berlusconi's example. It's overfreighting the public with so many false claims, and with just so much spectacle, and with so many things going on, that it becomes impossible for people to ascertain what's true or not, because if you have a normal sort of attention span to politics, which is to say a fraction of that of what most people in this room whose life it is to study politics have, you just cannot no longer. It's the opposite of what David was saying about the policy promise. It's not one lie that is defining of your presidency. You do 10 lies a day. And so nobody in the, 98% of the population don't have a patience to try and figure out the details on each of those claims. And so all you can do is to trust the people whom you trust. And if you're on the right, that'll mean, Fox News or to the right of that. And if it's on the left, it means, the kinds of things that we mostly probably consume, right? And I think that there's a difference between those two. I'm not saying that they're the same. But I, at this point, don't have the time and the patience to go through every claim and make my own assessment as to whether Donald Trump is actually true in the outrageous things he claims are happening. I simply
assume that they're false, because he has managed to overfreight the system so much that there's no other way of dealing with that. And that, I think, is a fundamental attack on the very possibility of having a truth-based discourse, or a political discourse in which truth sort of negotiates how we should act, that we haven't quite faced up to conceptually, much less in terms of our response to it.
Can I say something very brief about this?
Very brief.
Yeah, it's a question, actually. You know, Trump has a big Twitter following, but, you know, when he tweets something, it might get retweeted, I don't know, 10, 20, 30,000 times. It's nothing like Kim Kardashian, right? So my question is, why is it that every tweet is news? Why is the megaphone is actually the New York Times printing, you know, treating his tweet as news? And I wonder how you guys think about that, although we may not have time to talk about it.
So it does seem that the subject. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you want an answer to that? Well,
You're going to get the penultimate word here.
And also this is just like everything turns into my trying to answer for the New York Times, where I don't even work on the news desk. But look, the president is making statements, right? I mean, I don't know if you all noticed the Twitter account that turns every tweet into an official statement, but ridiculous as it is, that is what they are. And so then you have to make judgments as the news desk every day that covers the president. Well, which of these really matter? And that is hard to do. There is no question that there's all kinds of chaff with the wheat, but that is a tough decision for journalists to make. Something the president says, something provocative, isn't newsworthy. The problem with the refusal to stay away is we have things like, you know, the 4 days during Puerto Rico where Puerto Rico isn't on television because there's no electricity there and it's very hard to get images. And instead we're having some made-up fight about, you know, Colin Kaepernick and Steph Curry and black athletes, which is simply divisive. That is tough for journalists to push back on.
May I add one sentence? I know this will be to your question. The fact that the statements don't matter is why they matter. So when the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, says, with an 8.5-minute gap in between to give the Russians lots of time to get off a nuclear missile response, I am about to announce a total and complete ban on ... transgender soldiers in the military. And then the military says, thank you for your helpful comment.
Actually, no, you're not.
We certainly will take it into consideration and give it to you. And the military said, actually, no, we've thought it over. We're sticking to our original policy because his tweet... That's astonishing. That's an amazing thing. And the fact we have this system of government where the president proposes ideas from time to time, and the Secretary of Defense determines whether they'll become government policy.
Although the president certainly could have made that policy anyway.
We are out of time. I would just say that I think it's fitting, since we are a university, that the subject of truth is where we've ended up. We are, after all, our basic mission is the creation and dissemination of knowledge, and you know, some might go so far as to say that the movements within universities to question whether it's possible to actually generate, never mind disseminate, knowledge have created part of the intellectual and ideological terrain that makes what we've been talking about for the last 5 minutes possible. And perhaps in addition to being public intellectuals and coming out of our ivory towers and speaking in the public sphere, we might want to pay some attention to the recreation of norms of truth-telling and truth-seeking within our own institutions. But I want to thank everybody for participating, and particularly the people who've done all the tremendous amount of work to come here today. And thank you all very much indeed.